All right, folks, here we go with the notes for Chapter 10, talking about public television programming this time around. It's a special kind of television, and it's special in many different ways, and one of the ways that we pay a lot of attention to public TV in particular is talking about its validity these days. There's arguments that go against public television even being a thing, or if it's going to be a thing, whether government should be funding public television. Some of the arguments against it, there are those that accuse public TV of being left-leaning in its ideological stance, being as that it receives government money. There are those that feel as though it should be more nonpartisan, although the debate continues as to whether the fact that it is left-leaning is actually a correct argument. There are those that argue that it is and those that argue that it isn't. Some other arguments against public TV include it catering to elite audiences. This also is something that is up for debate, where public television has long had as part of its reason for operating that it provides programming for various audiences that may not have programming available to them through other broadcast outlets. But PBS also does tend to air programming that is a little more highbrow in nature, to the opinion of some. Also, they consider public television just unnecessary in and of itself, because there's all sorts of content that PBS offers in various other methods, including cable television, DVD, the internet, and so on. However, not all of those items are necessarily available throughout the country to everybody. TV in a broadcast fashion is pretty much available to just about everybody in the United States. It's got about 98 to 99% penetration of the U.S. population, where any other form of mass media, such as cable, the internet, and so on, is not necessarily accessible to everybody. There's less support from viewers these days as well. Ratings have fallen over the years. However, as we will see, ratings in and of itself is not necessarily the goal of public TV. Underwriting has slumped by about 50% in the years between 2000 and 2010. Shrinking support from universities, foundations, and viewer donations, all crippling PBS in recent history. And as a result, there's fewer public stations on the air, and you also tend to have larger associations of public broadcasting stations in many areas, such as North Carolina's system from UNC TV, broadcasting on several stations throughout the state of North Carolina. However, public television does persist and continue on. There's over 350 public stations covering 99% of the country. More than half of the country uses public broadcasting every month, so there are people that are tuning in and catching its content at some point in some way for some programming. Americans rate public television as one of the most trusted of all American institutions as well, partly because it is there to serve the public and, at least in theory, is not supposed to support a certain agenda. Let's talk about program philosophy now for public TV stations. They are united by beliefs that broadcasting should not only be a positive force in society, but that it should also reside outside the capitalist funding model that has defined U.S. broadcasting, i.e. commercials. So this is a stance in which they do not want to be influenced by outside forces, in particular by various corporations that would be supporting the programming by means of advertising. Non-commercial educational broadcasting. Let's talk about what that means. First off, there's a couple of arguments for the word educational. One argument saying that educational means instructional. Public television should teach and not compete for commercial television's mass audience. Another argument says that educational is defined in a much more broader sense, talking about things like enriching lives and responding to the needs of viewers. So is it just getting book smarts? Is it just an academic sort of thing? Or does the learning aspect, the educational aspect, reach deeper than just filling our heads with knowledge? So depending on how you look at that word educational is going to determine how you look at what the role of public television should be. In 1967, public television became a more neutral term to distance itself from the unpopular image of educational television. So public TV did start off more specifically as educational with that term. However, as we have come along, public TV has taken a much more loose sort of structure to it, where education is still an aspect of it, but it is also looking much more broad in scope in terms of serving the audiences of the United States. The public television programmer must come to grips with a station's particular programming philosophy. Now, this can be different in its nuances from station to station, from group to group, but there are two common themes that you're going to find at every public TV station. One is being educational, and the other is being non-commercial. Those two things at its core is going to describe every public TV station. Public broadcasting has a special mission to serve audiences that would otherwise be neglected because they are too small to interest the folks that provide commercial broadcasting. If you were to look at the programming guide for a public television station, you would find all sorts of different types of content, from cooking shows to nature shows, various types of documentaries that cover a wide range of subjects, and many times public television will cover subjects that just is not of interest to either broadcast television or cable television. So in those ways, public television has found itself as part of its mission to try to reach out to provide content to some of those populations that are not getting certain types of content that they're seeking. Public broadcasting reaches relatively large numbers of people cumulatively by reaching many small groups, and those many small groups add up. So it's not necessarily that people just turn on PBS and set it and forget it, but they will turn on PBS for specific types of programming at specific times. So there's people from many walks of life that may be watching PBS at a certain time or on a certain day of the week because of certain types of programming that's available. As far as the idea of commercial public television, we have commercial in quotes there. To appeal more powerfully to large underwriters, PBS has expanded the time devoted to underwriting credits and have changed their format so that they now resemble commercials. And we're going to talk a little bit about what the difference is between a commercial and an underwriting announcement. But if you have watched PBS programming, you may see that certain underwriting announcements do look a whole lot like commercials that you would see on regular television, and that is by design. However, they're very careful of the way that they put those underwriting announcements together. Again, we'll talk about the distinction in a bit. PBS and PBS stations have formed partnerships with commercial entities on various types of things. One of those in particular would be that if you go to a PBS website, you might see advertising on the web page. You might also see ads on some of the content that is streamed on the PBS website. So there's a distinction there in that the rules of non-commercial broadcast only apply to the broadcast channel itself. It does not apply to the rest of the things that public television does. And that's an important distinction because the non-commercial aspect is something that is governed by the FCC, and the FCC only controls as it applies to the airwaves, radio and television. So again, we'll talk about the distinction in a little bit. As far as the network model for public TV goes, a board of appointed and elected representatives govern PBS, and they do so for 3-year terms. So this would be the public broadcasting service as a whole. The PBS board of directors includes both professional directors who lead public television stations and general directors who represent the general public. So you have those that are part of the industry, part of these various stations, and you also have those that are not necessarily part of the industry that are involved. PBS uses a host of program suppliers and tries to promote and schedule their programs effectively while listening to independent producers as well as minority groups and program funders. So it's all part of taking the resources that are available and seeking out various resources in order to try to achieve the goals that they have as a public TV station. Instead of being paid as loyal affiliates, member stations pay PBS. This is a big distinction between what happens with the commercial broadcast networks and what happens on public television. In this case, the member stations, the affiliates of PBS, actually pay PBS to be part of that network. Now, PBS then in turn supplies the affiliates with programs sufficient to fill prime time and many daytime hours. And this is where you have membership dues and fees covering part of program costs. That's basically how that works. A public station's remaining broadcast hours are typically filled with least syndicated fare, also from local productions and programs supplied by other public television stations. You will most likely notice if you watch any amount of public television that sometimes you're going to find that the programming content will be a production of a local PBS station somewhere else around the country, and they will usually announce who that is. There's also a small consortium of various organizations that provide public television content, such as American Public TV. So you will notice those throughout the broadcast schedule on a PBS station, but nothing produced by PBS itself. Now, station scheduling autonomy. Here's another significant difference between PBS stations and affiliates of the commercial broadcast networks. Citing the principle of localism as public television's community service bedrock, station managers display considerable scheduling independence, ostensibly to make room for station-produced or acquired programs thought to meet some local need. Going back to that idea that a public television station is there in very large part to serve the public interest and do so in a way that meets the audience's needs of that market. Local stations will pretty much dictate to PBS which of the PBS shows they will take on and when they will be aired and that sort of thing. Now, commercial stations have the same rights to be able to do that with the network, but the network in commercial stations tends to have a lot more control over when the local affiliates air the content. There is right of refusal, but there's a lot of pressure on the network side for affiliates to air programming at the time and day that the network wants them to be aired. That sort of pressure is not as strong with public television stations. There will be encouragement from PBS that they air shows at a certain day and time so that nationally they can promote programs, but the local station has the final say ultimately. Until a networking agreement was worked out with the stations, no two stations' program schedules were remotely alike for the very reason we just talked about. National promotion, publicity, and advertising placement were, if not impossible, extremely difficult to achieve. And as a result, underwriters were not pleased with scheduling irregularities from one market to the next. So when PBS would try to get underwriters for various programs, it was difficult because, number one, they weren't commercials. They're very different in scope. But also, it was hard to know what announcements were going to be on at what times and what days in what markets. That was not a very clear answer that PBS could provide. So what started happening were things called carriage agreements. In 1979, you had what was called common carriage. It was a non-binding agreement among stations that establishes a core schedule. Core slots take on a premium quality. Underwriters and producers began demanding a time slot within the core period. So again, it was the idea that PBS started saying, here's what we would like you to do, stations, but it was ultimately up to the stations. Fast forward to 1987, PBS rolls out a policy called same-night carriage, and this is where selected broad appeal programs would be designated for carriage on the night which they are fed by satellite. And it was a policy that was not strictly enforced by PBS, but it was very much, again, that idea of pretty please, would you play along with us and do this? And then there was what came about in 1995, the new Common Carriage Agreement, where up to 350 hours of programming per year was obligated to air on the same night in prime time. Same night, but not necessarily same time around the country. So there was still a good bit of autonomy and flexibility at the local station level when it came to exactly what time various programs would air. Again, with the idea of the station keeping in mind the needs of its particular audience in its market. Now, a couple other things about PBS. PBS does involve itself in multicasting. Various channels are available to public stations for carriage, usually as digital subchannels. These are national feeds that have various bends towards the programming content that is on there. Create is a channel that has a lot of the workshops and the artists and that sort of thing. World is a kind of traveling sort of show that depicts various world areas, has some of the nature documentaries and that sort of thing. And up until recently, Sprout was what used to be known as PBS Kids. A lot of children's programming there. Sprout was recently acquired by NBC Universal. However, a lot of PBS stations still carry Sprout as a digital option. Now, here in North Carolina, UNC-TV has a kids channel. It also has its own version of World, which is called the Explorer channel. And then you also have what's called the North Carolina channel, which is in essence trying to focus a lot on things within the state of North Carolina. But many of the shows that are on these sub-channels help to feed the content on the sub-channels here on UNC television. Multiple platforms. Public television has very much embraced social media, including things like YouTube, online apps, podcasts on the NPR side, on the radio side. But it has very much built up its social media presence, and done very well with that throughout local stations and through PBS as a whole. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and take a break, and we'll continue on with section 6 of your notes when we look at part B of chapter 10.